Great. So lovely to meet you. My name's Karl Langford. Been in IT security for about 15 years now. Started my career as a sysadmin and then got into the dark depths. Worked more specifically in identity security for the last sort of 7 years at Beyond Trust. I'm joined today as well by my co-host, James.
Hi everyone, I'm James Maud. I'm a cybersecurity researcher at Beyond Trust with Karl. I've got a history in doing various bits of research, crawling my way out of a university and into industry. And we're very excited today to be joined by Marc Maiffret, who I read earlier was once described as corporate America's worst nightmare by Newsweek. So great to have you on, Marc. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Marc Maiffret, Chief Technology Officer for Beyond Trust. Also your boss, don't forget, James. But this is a free zone. Go where you will.
This is a safe space now.
This is a
Nothing
safe space.
happens.
Unleash, James.
Oh, amazing. Well, we'll start unleashing. It'd be really great to kind of understand when you first found an interest in technology, because you were pretty young, right?
Yeah, I think probably around 13. It was definitely I don't remember what the game at the time would have been, like Doom, Quake, something of that kind of era-ish. And obviously at the time I didn't even have a computer. So like my way of learning computers was at like the school library, hacking around on computers there and stuff. I eventually got my first 386 PC back in the day. At the time, all my friends were playing, I don't know what that would have been, Doom, Quake, something like that. And so for me, like not having a system that could like do video games, I was like, all right, well, what can I do with this thing? And I think one of the early kind of like basic languages that was like, built into DOS at the time was one of the first things I started kind of hacking around and just starting to learn from there.
Amazing. And then, yeah, you say starting to hack around in. What was the evolution of your hacking kind of like? So I guess you started with very small things by the sound of it. How did that escalate and get you into some more interesting stuff?
Yeah. So I guess in one way, before the hacking even was getting into phone phreaking, right? So essentially exploring the kind of telephone network. And so I was very lucky to kind of come up in hacking and in that space at a time when the internet was kind of starting to take off, but like the very like kind of roots of hacking in the old days, if you will, with like phone phreaking and stuff like that was still very much prevalent. And so there was actually a friend of mine, I think it was in maybe 7th or 8th grade in the US, that was in the phone phreaking, had kind of given me a couple of like phone phreaking type of like manuals or like, Zines from back in the day or whatever. And I got access to essentially my first like bulletin board, dial-up system that was like, a phone phreaker, bulletin board system. And so for me, everything first before hacking, I tend to talk about the hacking part, but like before that even was essentially, all the different red boxes and what you could do with the phone network itself. And then, in that transition where, if I say the word like tel-enet, right? Sometimes people think that's like a confused way of saying telnet, right? But I'm talking like the old school, like X25 networks from back in the day. Again, where that kind of like bridge between phone phreaking and then computer hacking and everything started. So I consider myself very lucky to come up at that time to have like been able to experience that like whole era and all the people that I like read about back in the day that were like these huge mythic, figures before any of the kind of modern, internet and hacking as we know it now.
Amazing. And then you started to fall into the internet at its birth, really, and kind of come across and say, hey, this looks quite interesting to me. I can learn from this. Where did that go?
Yeah, I think it was like probably for a lot of people, like the internet was like when you were coming from the kind of like phone phreaking and maybe doing stuff with like, like literally the classic out of a movie, like I'd go to the local business park and like, as a 14, 15-year-old, like go through companies' trash to actually try to find any sort of information I could. Would do things like war dialing, where you're essentially calling every phone number in the area to try to find, some sort of terminal that you could connect into. And so the internet was like this explosion in the sense of where you're like, okay, I'm not limited anymore by like the what my mom might yell at me for like, my phone bill of where I'm calling. Like, you weren't about to, like, I don't know, war dial Singapore or something like that, right? When you're living in California. So the internet was amazing because it was like this transition of like you were doing, the kind of phone freaking, searching for stuff with war dialing, that kind of thing. And then you're on the internet now and you're like, wow, I have all these different systems are out there all over the world, from companies to governments. It's just the kind of the exponential, nature of it all, right? Was just like, was awesome. And then of course also there's, there was a lot more like protocols and things that you could interact with technically than kind of, trying to get that right dial-up number, hopefully find the right, username, password in the trash, or do the right social engineering to the right person at the company. It kind of shifted that whole world of learning about, protocols and exploits and that kind of stuff, which is cool.
Brought a lot of connectivity back to you then, sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely for me at the time, I talk about it, but it was, I typically characterize it as growing up in kind of a crazy home life, and so computers for me were like the escape, and crazy in the context of like, you could put it as in a short way, like my stepdad died of a crack overdose, right? So when I say crazy, it was pretty crazy. And so I was lucky that computers for me was that escape, that place that I could go to, that I could have kind of essential sense of control to really be able to like learn more about, what was happening and explore. And we always talk about being able to have that virtual space to kind of escape to. I mean, it was absolutely that.
And you mentioned, Marc, that you got your break by not necessarily what you knew, but who you knew, because people were able to get you into the freaking scene and give you access to some of the zines and some of the bulletin boards. Then as kind of you went out into computing, I think one of the things that people often don't think about today is you didn't maybe have a server sat there with virtualization and all these tools on there and all these manuals and all this access to Google. How do I set something up? So how did you progress through in a journey onto the internet and under learning about systems?
Yeah, I think that's like the fun joke back in the day. Like hacking was, just getting your modem to actually work with Slackware or whatever, right? Like way back when. But no, it was kind of I think it was for me the most prolific part was probably the summer between 8th and 9th grade. So it was transitioning in the U.S. from middle school to high school. I keep saying in the U.S., for my Brits and such here, translated. But no, like that transition from middle school to high school, that summer, I mean, I think I rarely slept. I tried to read everything I could online, but to your point, there wasn't really a lot to read. There wasn't a lot of information out there on, hacking and everything else. So it was much more, and I think honestly still relevant today. Like when you're trying to go figure out a system and the weakness of the system, one of the best things you can do is go read the manual. I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but it's like very much like, say you're going to go attack a piece of software or whatever, like understanding all the nuance of it, of like, what the attack surface that might matter and kind of where you're going with it. But it definitely, in some ways there's some of the awesomeness that's been taken away because there's so much information out there now that it's less about trying to explore, for an entire day to find that like one nugget of information. Today, it's like you have all the information in the world being shoved at you, everything that's supposed to be important in security, all these different domain areas of expertise. And so you have the inverse problem of like, in this sea of tons of stuff, like what actually matters, right? Like what's actually important here? What's the first principles or those kind of core ideas that I should be caring about from a hacking, security, whatever your kind of domain is.
It's funny actually, because we've rapidly shifted to, like you say, far too much material. How do you find the good in the noise? How did you find people in those times, right? Like right now, hey, I love Discord, I love WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, whatever. What did you do then?
No, so that's actually that's a great question, right? I mean, I was definitely coming up at a time where, I think even before things like, kind of IRC were even popular as a precursor to a lot of today. And it's so funny looking back then as a teenager, because, your other peers at the time, other teenagers and stuff would be like, what? You chat with people online? And, it was like, you're like the super nerd for having done that, right? Now it's obviously a thing. But no, it was crazy how it worked. I mean, for me, it was, definitely with that, friend of mine in middle school that kind of got me that first exposure to hacking, was able to get on some BBSs. You end up, for me living in Southern California, I found some local BBSs. And then you find that there's like, a group of like-minded hackers that are talking on a BBS. And, we used to meet up, for example, there was I'm gonna confuse it, but there was essentially a restaurant in like downtown LA, and random hackers of all different ages, 14, 15-year-old like myself, somebody be in their 30s hacking on stuff. I remember one of the times I was down there, and I'm, really dating myself with some of this, but, this was back when like, cell phones were essentially unencrypted in the most basic way. So anybody could listen in. Pagers were obviously just being, sent so anybody could intercept. And so I was in LA, and I wish I could remember the restaurant because other hackers at the time would definitely know the reference. But anyways, we're at this restaurant, and there's like people that have, not like the slim MacBook laptop that you have today, but maybe like a desktop with a monitor that they lugged in from the car and is sitting on the table at like, the equivalent of a Denny's or something in the States. And like, and you have somebody on their screen that's got like a software hardware antenna going that's like decoding pagers, in the middle of downtown LA, of all the business people that were sending out pages, what's happening. Somebody else who's got like a modified, back in the day, you could take Oki 900 cell phones and essentially modify them with custom software to actually go listen in on other cell phones. By the way, if I'm screwing up the nuance here, I hope my friends to call me out later online, because this is stretching the memory. And so like finding a group like that was, that two-step process from kind of like, bulletin board systems, et cetera, but started with a random friend at school, led to now you're meeting up in person. And then obviously with the progression with the internet, then you started to have, IRC was probably the biggest area that everybody kind of gathered around, until, today's, various like social media, Discord, all the nicer ways of doing it. So just the old school word of mouth and human connection, it was cool.
I like the fact you mentioned BBS a few times, but some of our younger listeners might not know what that is. Do you want to just kind of throw that out there for a second?
Yeah. So your computer used to have to make these screeching noises. No. So before the magic of internet everywhere, everything, right? Your computer would have a modem. I mean, literally device plugged into your phone line, dialing into what was called a bulletin board system. So it'd be, literally it could be a computer sitting at somebody's house that had a few phone lines running into it that other people would log into. You would leave messages because there was only so many phone lines, so you couldn't have necessarily 500 people sitting on the thing, right? So people would dial up into it, leave messages for each other, and it was this kind of async back and forth, right? And that was kind of like how information was getting traded, and people would recommend go check out this other BBS. You'd be in the middle of doing all that. Mom would pick up the telephone line to call and disconnect you. All the fun stuff of the day.
People had phones in their house. Can you believe that? God.
Exactly.
It's just throwing me right back. One of the things I did hear about your connections was that you took a little trip away across the country. Is that right? To go meet some people? Yeah.
So when I was like 15 or so, and kind of what I was mentioning with my home life being crazy, and I essentially had this like realization or like event one day that like I just had to change everything up completely, right? Like if I was going to kind of make it out of things and stuff. And so for me, that culminated in essentially when I was 15, running away from home. I had some hacker friends. There was a group that I was a part of called Rhino 9. I had some hacker friends in Florida, and with the least amount of money to essentially get on a Greyhound bus from Los Angeles, California, going to Florida, and just jumped on the bus to head out and like see kind of just escape of sorts, but no real actual plan. Another one of the many moments in my life, especially during that time, that like could have gone very, very wrong, but everything kind of worked out at some degree. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend Greyhound bus as a mode of transport.
Well, we'll keep that one off for show notes, eh? Speaking of misadventure, though, obviously one of the things I think you're famous for was your very early raid by the FBI. What happened there?
I like the what happened from my neighbor's perspective,
Okay.
because from my perspective, as I normally would tell, it's like, I had some sense or understanding that I was going to be raided, and so I was I think I was 17 at the time, and so I was at my mom's house, and I basically told her like, hey, I think I might get raided. She didn't quite comprehend all of what that meant. Like, she knew I was into computers, but she didn't kind of get everything that was going on. And she, like a parent would if kids are talking about crazy stuff or whatever, be like, okay, sure, because kids going through something.
Must be a new game.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah, it must be talking about some new video game or something, right? And so I remember that the morning I was raided, my mom came in. And she was like, well, like everything's okay, I guess, or whatever, and I ended up, I fell back asleep, and then I felt something kind of like by my head and went to brush it away. And I thought it was, like you fall back asleep, you don't know, is it an hour later, 2 minutes later, whatever. And I thought it was like, my mom had talked to me, I'm falling asleep. And then she's just kind of like, I don't know, patting my head goodbye to work or whatever, right? And no, it was an FBI guy with a gun to my head telling me like, don't move. The thing that, from my neighbor's perspective, though, is that essentially a bunch of cars pulling up, people, FBI had local law enforcement, and actually somebody from the DoD, everybody with guns coming over like the fences, going around the whole house, which always sounds like dramatic when I tell people that, right? Because they're just like, well, you're just like this computer nerd hacking in, like why all the aggressiveness or whatever, but they don't really kind of treat it one way or the other. It's like they don't really know what's going on in the place, or how crazy a kid maybe I was or not, right? So anyways, from my neighbor's perspective, which when you're living in kind of like suburbia where like people not bringing in their trashes on time is the big event in the neighborhood, to have vans and people showing up with guns, jumping fences and stuff was I think more shocking for them than me waking up realizing, wow, there's FBI guys standing here, and I joke about it, but that very much was like the literal wake up call, right? I was lucky in that I was never like, arrested, never had, I wasn't doing hacking in the sense of the kind of like cybercrime type of stuff that we think about today, right? It was much more exploring, taking the same idea of like, BBS is doing dial-up, war dialing, all that, and like how do you go explore now on the internet and learn about systems by breaking into them? Because all this fancy virtualization and stuff the kids have these days to set up your own CTF lab, like you didn't have that back then, right? Like you wanted to go learn about, Solaris or whatever back in the day, like you were going to go do that by breaking into a university that had it, something like that.
Amazing. Sounds pretty intense, pretty scary. Everything rolled into one. I guess this interview is a bit more friendlier than the FBI interview you must have sat through.
So far, but I'm still giving you guys some time. So, we'll see.
We'll see. One thing I was wondering, though, did they even understand what you were doing? Like the people there, the people asking you the questions, like they're in a room interviewing you, but do they even know what they're asking? Like, how did that work? To an extent,
right? Like I think, especially early on, there's always been like times in culture, right, where people try to come up with like the next boogeyman to like point as a reason to like change policy, put new things down on society, etc. And so kind of the context for the time then was there was a lot in the news about like hackers who were really more folks like me that were like breaking into sites, maybe defacing a web page, something like that. Very different than like, the claims at the time of like, hackers are going to bring down all the systems and hurt people and all like very, very crazy claims. And so what was really interesting, and I think why things came to a head for me, is that the reality of like hacking versus like what it was being hyped up as this like next boogeyman, that we needed to have all these new laws to like weaken encryption, to do this, that, and the other. As a teenager, it's not like I could go write the New York Times and say, hey, here's what's really happening, and the reality of like what maybe an attorney general at the time was saying versus what was actually taking place, right? And so the way that you could get that voice out though as a hacker would be to, go find the high profile website and, in your best 17-year-old writing, which is super cringy now, I'm sure, if I read, try to put out a message of like, here's what's actually happening versus the contrast of like the teen hacker, cyber terrorist type situations or whatever, right? And so I think there's always those things where where you have to balance, like, what is the kind of the real fear and worry of like what we should be thinking about with society versus like, sometimes motivations of others that are, looking to use that fear kind of really for different means, or kind of different means to an end, if you will.
Did the MTV kind of coverage play up the myth or play up the reality?
I think both. There was definitely some good and bad to that. I think my favorite part of all that was definitely friends from the loft, right? I mean, when you look at Mudge, Weld, everybody else, right? Like, I think they've always been like kind of this awesome, from then to now, kind of, I want to say beacon, because Weld will probably make fun of me for using words like that with them. But I think they've always been kind of this like beacon of like, the combination of like hacking as research and everything else, and being able to show the kind of like the different view of it. And I mean, you see that now with, everything a lot of those guys have done. So I think there was shades of interesting there. I hope I was trying to be closer to that than maybe some of the other stuff. But
I thought it was really interesting, actually, in listening to you talk about kind of how you got into this space. One of the things you said in the interview was the internet's free from parents. That's been a change, I feel.
I mean, you can still, it depends on how creative you are. All right, kids, it depends how creative you are.
Oh, I mean, incredible.
I joke about that with having, my own young daughter now, and my wife will be like, so you're gonna like, super lock down the internet or this or that? And I'm like, I think so, but probably not for the normal reason, more for like I'm just curious to see what this kid will do, trying to undo the things, right? versus the censorship as a replacement for parenting,
I like it. I thought it was really interesting, some of the kind of characters you've mentioned so far on the way as well. Are there any kind of people that really stand out in your mind, really shaped you in kind of your career and your I guess love for the technology?
I think there's probably a lot of them. No, there's probably a lot. Like I think I've often talked about my friend Barnaby Jack, the late Barnaby Jack. We lost him a few years ago now. He was somebody that I met very early in my own career, and so we met at a time when we were both kind of like on IRC, first getting onto the internet, like very early days of security vulnerability research, and I met him in a Win32 assembly channel. So essentially, I was at the time finding a lot of basically the very first Microsoft remote system vulnerabilities, but there was less information on like, okay, I have a buffer overflow and name your Windows service at the time. How do I actually exploit it? What does shellcode look like in Windows? All these things were kind of foreign concepts. There was obviously previous domain knowledge in the kind of Unix Linux world, but in the Windows space, it was super early. And so I kind of decided that like, I needed to try to find somebody I could like work with that maybe had not the understanding of how to write a Windows exploit, because again, the domain expertise lacked, but somebody who maybe knew Windows assembly really well, and then with my security and kind of hacking experience, we could kind of work together, fumble through and figure it out. And so that's very much what happened with my friend Barnes. And he at the time was writing a lot of low level like assembly, more for doing like, software cracks or like trainers or whatever else back in the day. And yeah, we hit it off immediately. And, as I always talk, it was like, in the many years that like I knew him and all the different things that like we worked on, it wasn't so much just all the awesome technical stuff that like I could learn from him and that I like, did with him. But just like the way the guy lives, right? I mean, I think that it's one thing for us of like what we're all trying to develop and do personally and professionally, but you gotta have like fun along the way and be surrounded by people that are just, bringing out the best. And Barnes was definitely that in spades. So I think there was a lot that I always take away from that relationship, in the sense of like both like the technical aspects, but also like the showmanship of like, how do you kind of present some of the more technical things in a way that like is going to help like actually cause change out there and drive like the right kind of awareness, right? I mean, definitely a lot of people. I mean, I think there's the people that like I think are like the hackers, if you will. So somebody like Solar Designer, I won't even be able to say enough. You got to kind of Google somebody like that. That's somebody who's been just at the forefront of so many things for so long. And I don't even know him well personally or anything. It's just somebody I've always admired for their just technical ability and many other things. And the fact that, a lot of people probably don't know who that is, but they're if you go ask the, whoever you want to find as the who's of vulnerability researchers, unless they're maybe only in it in the last couple of years or so, like they would definitely, know somebody like Solar Designer. So there's that variety of people that I've both like, worked and been friends with that have been an inspiration, and then people that I've, haven't even talked to, but I've always looked up to their work in a tremendous way.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah, man.
One of the things when I was doing some research as well, I found, I think it was an old keynote with you in Barnes, where you were attacking sort of SMB routers and connected devices. Which had like really poor security. And I think it was like your whole EI crew at the time.
Right.
Now,
right.
What I loved about that is 30 years later, it feels like we're there. Like we're still shipping
right.
like the internet of shit out there and connecting stuff randomly with a really poor security.
So
how do you feel about that? Why do you think it's kind of taken so long to even move anything?
I mean, that's a perfect example, right? So that the reference there, right, is the before the Internet of Things was even a phrase that we uttered. It was at a time back in my very first security company, EI. We were very, very well known for like Windows vulnerability research and had done all sorts of interesting things in that space. And so there was a few of the folks that started to kind of get literally bored by like, it's another remote system in Microsoft. I mean, it sounds silly these days, but they were finding so many of them that it literally got boring for them. And so there was one of my friends working at EI at the time was a just awesome guy, Yuji Ukai, who runs a rad company out of Japan these days. But anyways, Yuji had a background and part of his like PhD research had been around like medical hardware devices. And so he, being a hacker by background, had started to kind of look at the two, and he was doing some of the very first hardware hacking, literally hooking up what's called like a JTAG device on most of your electronics, like your Netgear home router or something. If you like take the case off, there'll be a series of contact points where you can essentially hook up a hardware debugger to actually debug it just as if it was software. I'm very simplifying, but that's the general gist of it. And so Yuji had been into that a bit. Barnes was getting bored with just breaking Windows like it was nothing. And so I was like, okay, we should start looking in this space, because like at the time, home networking equipment and kind of IoT, again before it was IoT, was starting to proliferate. And when we first started looking, one of the very first devices that Barnes and Yuji started looking at was a D-Link home router. And so that eventually led to research where he was able to figure out remote code execution on the D-Link device. And so it becomes interesting where you're like, all right, I'm executing code on this D-Link device. Like, what could I do with it, right? And so we actually had a presentation that a few of us were doing a few different presentations for this kind of like joint kind of industry government conference that was put on by the National Security Agency. And so we're trying to figure out like what would be a good, payload to show this, this audience of interesting folks. And what Barnes ended up settling on was that using the remote code execution, he would basically look for any executables that were being downloaded through the router, and then one in every 5 or whatever it is, he would essentially patch the executable to have like actual Windows backdoor code in it, so that way you're not just compromising the router, but any system that's doing like software updates behind it, and that would be hopefully harder these days, because hopefully stuff's properly code signed and hopefully it's properly validated. It's not, but that was kind of where that led. And so it's to your point in your question though, of the like it's probably just as easy in some areas then, and that's going back probably 15 years or something, right? Like that sort of a thing. I think most things take it just takes time to evolve, but there's also seems to be like, and maybe it's human nature, we seem to have like enough pain and enough bad things happen to finally kind of do something about it, right? And so you look at like for Microsoft and kind of like when they had their big epiphany of trustworthy computing and kind of trying to get to the next level themselves. I mean, it wasn't just because folks like ourselves were out there kind of talking and trying to create awareness. There was also like a lot of big high profile worms. There was stuff behind the scenes where I won't name the company, but one of the largest banks in the US telling Microsoft, if they don't get their stuff together, they're going to completely switch, and that was because of all these different attacks and things. And so I think in the IoT, and I think also maybe what's harder today in general is like worms back in the day were this thing that would create this like super broad awareness, right? Because everybody could see it, feel it, the impact was there, and it was kind of hitting everybody, but they weren't really that bad in the sense. Some of them maybe were, but it wasn't like, ransomware or like a wiper malware level thing. So you had very, very high levels of awareness, lower level of impact. Today, we have the attacks that are much more tailored, much more targeted. They're not broad. They create less awareness. And so it creates this kind of sense of culture of like, you're seeing your kind of peers at different companies getting hit, but like, well, it's not me yet, right? And so there's something to be said about that kind of like shot in the arm, or like the little bit of wake up call that doesn't quite take you down fully, right? So I think the IoT space suffers for that in some sense, right? That it's all kind of nuanced, targeted. But there are some good conversations out there of like, planned obsolescence, of like just making a max shelf life, knowing these things aren't managed right. And there's all sorts of awesome people in that space that are trying to really set down some like, kind of policies of sorts of like, here's the minimum standards, like maybe ASLR shouldn't be controversial or whatever, right? Like the different OS safeguards and stuff like that in 2022.
So, let's wind the clock back a bit, Marc, because you mentioned a few things there. Your company, TiNege Digital. So you came from being this kind of hacker kid, starting off with phones, bulletin boards, getting yourself in trouble, exploring systems that you maybe shouldn't have been exploring. And then was it at 18 you went on to co-found TiNege Digital?
Yeah, I think I was actually 17 at the time still. Yeah.
So how did you do that? The way you're talking, was that a natural transition that you saw there was an opportunity to defend? Because some people just like to, sit there throwing the rocks rather than fixing the things, but you seem to have a bit of a passion for exposing that. And like you said, the shot in the arm, raising attention to things so people start to defend against them. So how was that transition for you from kind of teenage hacker into starting a business effectively?
It's a great question. I mean, at the time, I think like a lot of hackers at the time, you're always trying to write different tools that would help kind of automate and simplify your process of, breaking in or maintaining access or whatever you were doing. And so an area for me that I was very passionate around was kind of the how do you go look at a bunch of companies and try to identify like what are the weaknesses that I could use to go break into them, right? And it became very clear that like one of the ways that I could help companies was to give them that same sort of view. I mean, literally to the point, I think one of the very first taglines we had at EI was like, think like a hacker, in the sense of like, we were creating vulnerability scanning at the time solutions, which was really just taking a lot of what I was doing from that, like, script kiddie mentality of like looking at a bunch of environments to find the ways that I could break in and figure out, okay, what does software look like to do that? But then more importantly, to recommend to people how to actually go fix those problems, right? How to go change configuration, some of the stuff that you do beyond just patching it, that sort of thing. And I found it even more exciting kind of later in my like software CTO career, when we started working on endpoint security software and really getting into the heart of like, we're finding all these vulnerabilities that will allow people to break into systems, but what does it look like to really try to build the better mousetrap or try to defend from these things? And I always recommend people, if you have the opportunity to work on like both offense and defense, to just get the two perspectives is really helpful. It's not to say either one is better than the other. Both are important, right? But for me, I definitely love the challenge of how do you actually defend from these things. I definitely kind of started more on the offensive vulnerability side, and over time got much more interested in the what do I do about preventing it. But I think being informed by that like offensive view from the get-go helps kind of focus you on maybe more real world attacks and kind of real world defense, I should say, and not kind of spending your time on the stuff that like is good on a security checklist checkbox, but doesn't really do anything for you in the real world.
Yeah, and I think it's worth calling out as well that when you were building these vulnerability scanning tools for people to understand their exposure to risk, that wasn't really a thing at the time. This is kind of an area that you pioneered in, and the businesses didn't necessarily have tools or visibility. You didn't just have an automated cloud pen test running or vulnerability scanning within your environment. These were new tools.
Yeah, it was very early on. It was essentially there had been like a variety of different tools that were trying to do that sort of like scanning and stuff. But I mean, we take it for granted now that like if you're a large company, you have like a vulnerability management team, right? I mean, this goes back to when it was like just trying to get people to understand that you should go actively scan your environment to look for vulnerabilities. I mean, there was us and like the 2-3 companies at the time that were in all their infancies that were like trying to do something like that and trying to essentially educate the market on like this is a part of security. And now it's like the very much the backbone of any sort of vulnerability management compliance type of group at a company.
And we can't talk about yourself and EI Digital without talking about Code Red. So for people, hopefully everyone's familiar with Code Red, but this was a very famous internet worm, as you mentioned earlier, internet worms. And this really catapulted the coverage in. So do you want to just talk through people how you came to discover Code Red?
Yeah, with Code Red, so the vulnerability that Code Red used to actually propagate to different systems was found by one of my researchers at the time, awesome guy named Riley Hassel. And so we were very active in the vulnerability research space. We were doing a lot with, vulnerability management software scanning for vulnerabilities. But we had also created one of the very first precursors to what we call WAFs now, or web application firewall. So before WAF was a term that existed, we created a product that was specific for securing IIS web servers. And a lot of that was because we were finding so many of these vulnerabilities, and we were seeing how so many of them would have been preventable, that we decided to do something about it and create like a defensive software for that. And so through creating that kind of software and that vulnerability research, we became well known for that. And so there was a a time when we essentially had a customer reach out to us saying that, hey, I think something's going on with my web server. It seems to be making weird connections, right? And so we asked them for a packet, network capture, packet capture, and myself and Ryan Perma, we ended up going through it and finding out that, in fact, in the packet capture there was like full-blown exploit taking advantage of the vulnerability that we had, that Riley had previously found. And it was essentially compromising the Microsoft IS web servers and spreading. But I think the thing that always, more than just kind of like even discovering the worm and some of the stories related to that, is like, to me, it was one of the points where it really got me thinking deeply about like attack surface as like kind of one of the most important concepts in security, and the fact that something like code red, that you could have had your server, even if it was unpatched, you wouldn't have been affected had there been like this one checkbox in IIS that was checked that basically would just verify that for a given ISAPI extension that like a file existed, right? So that got my mind going a lot on the okay, this is attack surface that is left and open by default from the vendor that 99% of the customers don't actually use or need. And so how do you start to, either through kind of educating people on looking at security controls to reduce their attack surface, or how do you start to, create products or tools that can help a customer understand what is their attack surface? So it got me thinking less about what we were doing with like vulnerability scanning, vulnerability management as like a vulnerability kind of reduction play versus like an attack surface reduction, right? To try to get away from the whack-a-mole of one-off individual vulnerabilities, right? And really, that's the same thing I'd tell security teams these days, right? If your environment is not resilient enough to withstand kind of a single vulnerability failure or something of that nature, right? Then there's a lot of other controls and things that you should be thinking about first, right? You should be able to have even something in a sense like take more recently with the log4j vulnerability, right? Super straightforward vulnerability to leverage and use. And so when you look at something like that, like, yes, you should identify it. Yes, you should patch, etc. But you should also not so easily have like your servers that are doing, egress to the internet in totally unrestricted ways, like that vulnerability and exploit reaching back, in the ways that it can, should not be something that just like happens by default, right? And that's one vulnerability, one example, right? But you could point to the last 50 things where things like egress filtering and doing more proper tailored security controls would limit it to where, yes, that vulnerability is there, but the attacker is either blocked from being able to use it or is probably going to trip some sort of hopefully custom detection that you've written for that kind of more tailored control that you've put around your attack surface.
And the impact of code red itself, because at the time it was huge, right? I think I read it was peaked about 359,000 infected systems, which in what was that, 2001, around that time?
I'm terrible of timelines, but yes.
somewhere around that timeline there, wasn't it? Yeah. So at that time, that many systems being infected, and presumably it wasn't as, like you say, as devastating as a modern ransomware attack or some of the tactics we see being deployed today. But if you saw an attack of that scale happen today, that would be on every news broadcast everywhere, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to really put it into context is like these days something like that, we kind of understand what it means, right? But like quite literally, me and Ryan, that Friday night, we were literally hanging out in his apartment. I think we were playing like Tony Hawk Pro Skater on Xbox or whatever it would have been, PlayStation or whatever at the time. When we got the email, we were like, maybe we should take a break from video games and go check this thing out. And so, just out of pure passion, it wasn't like we got to go find the next APT or the next worm. That just wasn't even a thought back then. We were just like, weird thing happening. That sounds nerdy and interesting. Let's go dive into that and figure it out. And so for the context of the time is like, by the time we were done that weekend and we put out the research on like the Monday morning, like we didn't understand like what was about to like happen, right? Like we didn't know that, like some of the stories I've kind of mentioned before of like we didn't know the White House was going to be calling us in a real way, or that the head of marketing of Pepsi was going to hit us up and start sending us, free Code Red soft drinks, or that it would be on every major news thing. Like that wasn't a thought, right? Like these days, there's a lot of security companies, they try to optimize for like, I got to be the next thing to talk about the next APT and get that next, magic branded thing out. Like, I mean, with Code Red, like we called it Code Red because we were drinking Code Red Mountain Dew and we liked the soda. Like, you know what I mean? It was just such a we were going to look at that and we were going to research that regardless of anything, just because it was nerdy and interesting from a security perspective, right? And that kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier, where I think there's like so much information and so much noise that sometimes the passion of just like exploring and just kind of seeing where things go, right? That can get lost for people at times, right? So.
Absolutely. And it just amuses me because when I used to work at university, we used to have a lecture, and one of them was about vulnerability research and talking about Code Red. And a lot of the students used to assume it was because it said hacked by the Chinese that it was called Code Red. And we had to point out that it was because you were drinking a caffeinated soda. And that's why you called it. So do you think Code Red was kind of the thing did that really propel you into the mainstream and suddenly elevated the profile of yourself and the company?
I think so. I mean, I'd already done a decent amount of stuff by then. I think Code Red was like, I think it was more of like just for the industry in general, right? Kind of like what I was talking about, even with Microsoft, right? It was just like a larger wake up call, like for the industry of like, imagine if you had such easy of a vulnerability that our remote system in that case, right? Your remote system access to every web server, hanging out on the internet, right? And imagine that like in today's times, right? And again, we've had stuff like that even still, right? Even in the Microsoft context, like wasn't that long ago, we had Print Nightmare where you could just run rampant, and still probably in a lot of areas in the corporate world, you could run rampant on Print Nightmare. So I think it was like more than just like with me and Ryan and like the EI team at the time. It was just like this larger like wake up call for the industry, for the Microsofts of the world, of like, we better start like figuring out how to do this better. Like I'll give you one last example on that of like the infancy at the time. These days there's all sorts of sensors and everything else on the internet. There's all sorts of projects that will track what's being scanned, like who's doing scans for known vulnerability XYZ, right? And they have all that telemetry. Code Red was actually taking place. It was already infecting companies in a broad way for about, it was either 2 or 3 weeks prior to us actually finding it, that the whole industry had no idea, right? And to me, that was one of the biggest takeaways, that you have this thing that was just very loudly crashing. Like if the exploit failed, right, in the case of like a memory corruption that you're trying to execute, it would actually cause IS to crash, right? And so you can go back and see, all sorts of like, IT threads and stuff out on the internet, these news groups, etc., where people are talking about their web servers crashing and stuff, and it's very clearly Code Red based on some of the other specifics, and the whole industry just didn't see it at all, right? And again, we still have that today, because there's going to be the APT, whatever you want to call it, tomorrow, and everybody will go tell you like, hey, look at this thing we found, it's awesome, totally forgetting about the fact that it was existing for 2 months at name your different customers, and kind of how we're measuring ourselves as an industry on that, right? But yeah, I think it was just a broad wake up call in general.
Absolutely. And it's one of those cases that where the CEO might not be interested in the website, suddenly if it's defaced, suddenly there's an interest in the website. And then people realize that, things need to be done about this.
Yeah.
One of the things as well you've talked about is that wake-up call, that alert moment. And, if you read back through some of the news articles of yourself over the years, not only did you kind of have a bit of a counterculture look about you, the hair, and you've always got a smile on your face, but you actually, some of the quotes I read, like, talking about Microsoft saying it's like having the cure and not sharing it with anybody, and pushing back against the establishment. And when everyone was talking about assume breach and detection is dead, you came out and said no, talks about the attack surface again. So do you think that's been a key part of your narrative about keeping people focused on the positive things they can do, the changes they can make?
Yeah, I think absolutely, right? Like, I think in some ways too, coming up from kind of the hacking scene, right? Like, the security industry in itself, like, there wasn't really a big security industry when I started, right? There was like a few big antivirus companies, and that was kind of it, right? So there was this weird mix of, like, hackers turned entrepreneurs, turned etc. And so there was almost a feeling in the beginning for I know, talking to a lot of my friends that went through similar experience of like that, like, oh man, am I like the sellout guy, right? I'm like the hacker guy. Now I'm doing the company thing. I mean, there was that feeling that, like, the 20 plus years ago or whatever. And I think the thing for me that I realized of, like, to stay true to myself, right? It's like, I don't want to just figure out like another product to build and sell a customer, right? Like, I don't think that's going far enough, right? I think that, like, all the different products that you could kind of build or security tools that you could have are all super important, right? Because they're tools that a customer can use to kind of get to their, like, end goal. But I think far too often people talk about, like, I'm going to go fight for my customers or whatever it is. And I think that has to be more than just, again, like some product that you're selling. That has to be, what can you do? Like, when I look at something like EI, right, where it's like, yeah, we were selling vulnerability management software and we wanted to have the best ability to go look for vulnerabilities in customers' environments. But we also realized that, like, with Microsoft and where they were at the time, right, of kind of looking at security as more of a marketing than a technical challenge, as back then, we knew that, like, what we were doing from a vulnerability research perspective was as important to our customers, right? Because it was the kind of cultural changes that needed to happen. And I talk about that a lot, right? Where I think the easy part of all of our jobs, right, like working in security, is in some ways the kind of technical tools and technical recommendations we make, but shifting the culture of a company, shifting the culture of an industry, shifting the culture of how IT people might be thinking about security. One of my current things I talk about often is getting people to think more on that, like, first principles around, like, identity access, where it's like, you're not chasing what's the next individual vulnerability, the next individual threat actor, et cetera, right? It's the knowing that in almost every breach, right, there's going to be some level of access required, some level of the right identities that need to be compromised. How do you get to those first principle concepts? And so that sort of education, and trying to put that out there, I mean, that's more than kind of anything you might build, for somebody sitting in my seat as like a CTO, right? Like, it's more that more than just like the product that you want to build or tell people about.
I think you might have actually answered my next question already there. That I was going to say that, we've already talked about how you started off with the vulnerability scanning before that was a thing, getting that out to people. You talked about, you were building basically web application firewalls, looking at egress filtering. In fact, I was looking through the way back when archive on the old EI site and found the description of Retina from the early 2000s, where you're talking about shattering the mold of traditional security scanners through the use of artificial intelligence and simulating common hacking attack methods, which is basically what a lot of people in the industry are selling today. And, the concepts of EDR and things all came along from, like, your early concepts, really. So my question was, where do you think we should go next? What's the next thing you're seeing? Is it the identity piece you talked about? Is it the training and awareness? Is it something else?
I think sometimes if the question itself of, like, where to go next is I think a really important question. I look at it more as the principles of, like, what you should do from a security perspective, and in a lot of ways, like, what you should do at a foundational level hasn't really changed now or even 20 years ago. So there's more like where you should apply those principles next versus, like, I think sometimes if somebody's sitting working in, like, an InfoSec team, the version or the answer they might give on where to go next is, like, name a new product category or name a new, threat prevention solution X or this or that. And I think the important part, right, is that, you go back, one concept I talk about a lot is, like, least privilege, right? And so when you look at a concept like least privilege, it's one of these, like, timeless ideas, right? Going back, if you're interviewing me at home right now, I'd have my bookshelf behind me with the old school DoD rainbow books, and they talk about least privilege back in like the 80s, right? And a concept like least privilege, right? Making sure that like an employee, or even in today's world, like a machine identity, right, has like the least amount of access to an environment, that they only need access to what they need access to. That's like a timeless concept. And so I would answer your question like in two ways of like, there's not necessarily like the nowhere to go. It's like, keep doing those timeless concepts of like reduce your attack surface, like do least privilege, etc. Right? Now the thing that isn't constant, right, is again, where do you apply these ideas, right? And so when it might have been, the 20 years ago, rainbow books talking about least privilege in reference to like maybe Multics or whatever, whatever crazy thing, to then Windows environments. And then obviously all the same challenges exist when you look at cloud environments, right? Like what does least privilege look like from a cloud perspective? What does reducing your attack surface look like? So I always try to tell people to kind of focus more on the, we got a book coming, focus more on.
I was just going to say, Raymond Chen, the old new thing. You always remind me of that title.
Much it. That's pretty much it, right? So it's much more that of like, don't chase the new thing as a security person in terms of like the new widget that's supposed to fix it all, right? Like learn the kind of core principles of security that I think are very timeless, and then make sure you're paying attention to like, if you're working at your, a company, like you're working at a bank, like understand where the business is going, right? So if you know that the business is going to be shifting over time because you talk consistently with your counterparts in IT that they're going to be moving to Kubernetes as a thing in the future, then for me, it's less the, okay, what's the magic next thing that I'm kind of bolting on there versus like, all right, let me understand the first principles of like, what does least privilege look like in a Kubernetes environment? Like, what does it mean when like you have a container that has been given, that has been overprivileged with like Linux capabilities that allow it to, do things it shouldn't, if you will. I was trying to remember, there was a vulnerability literally weeks ago where if you had the wrong privilege on the container, you can escape to the host. Anyways, sidetracking myself. But that's kind of how I think about it, is the understand where your business is going. Because if you were to ever ask like, okay, 5 years from now, where's security going to be? Nobody really has a clue, because security is usually a reaction and a reflection to where business is going, where technology is going. So you need to pay attention to that, right? Like you could go back in time and find a point in time where nobody was talking about Kubernetes security as a thing you should be paying attention to, right? And now it's, for a lot of companies, a thing that they're just trying to get their hands around, right? So I would kind of answer it in those two ways of know your principles and then know where to apply them going forward.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
That's something kind of on that track as well for you, Marc. So obviously the way you handled Code Red, first kind of an industry of responsible disclosure and going through, what do you think some of the kind of legacies you left are in the industry from having that mindset and taking that approach?
Oh man, I mean that's a hard one for me to answer, because I get comfortable talking about myself in that way. So I don't know. I hope I've left. Let me answer it this way. I think the thing that I'm proudest about, and that like I continue to try to do to this day, is all the people that I've had a chance to work with, whether it was hiring them for like their original job in security, or maybe they were kind of early on in their career and having a chance to see these people go on to do amazing things, like found and run some of the biggest companies that are out there, and found some of the biggest security companies that are out there. Like, and I never say that stuff as like I'm not responsible for their success. It's not like, oh, Marc hired a mentor and that's why they're doing that. It's not that at all. It's being able to find people like that. And the way I always put it is like, hold up a mirror to be like, hey, they might not see in themselves like what I see, right? To have that chance to be like, I mean, I look at like with guys like you, right? Like, I mean, we all work together. Like I see that in you guys, right? Like anything I could do to kind of hold up the mirror and see, make sure you guys see all the awesome stuff I do. And you guys, I think is really like if I could try to keep doing more of that, right?
I read something on an old SecList post that I think it was you and Wim were kind of going backwards and forwards on. there was like one statement which was "Be more Barnaby." So thinking about your friend, like what would "Be more Barnaby" mean to people who aren't familiar with him?
Yeah, I think. Oh man, there's a lot. I think it's just like, the embrace life. I mean, we've talked about so many serious different security things, and security obviously is like serious in its own way, right? But like, I also think you can't take everything like, too serious. Like you can't, the moment that you start, the moment that it does become a feeling of like it's just purely work, right, is like where you could kind of lose that passion, right? So I think especially for a lot of us working in security, there's always this kind of like push to like be more, do more, climb the ladder in a certain way, career trajectory in a certain way that's like expected. And it's like, I always say like, if you're just stoked to be like sitting around looking and doing like malware research, and you don't have this different aspiration of like becoming a CISO or whatever, it's like, do that, like follow the thing. Like yeah, I think it's just in that simple way of like, finding what makes you happy, right? And just being like honest with yourself about it is really it. And like in the case of like Barnes, right? I mean, I think the biggest thing with him is that he not only was not only just like happy dude that was just super inspiring to many, but I mean, he'd walk in the room and like light the place up, and like everybody was instantly having like a better time for it, right? So I always kind of put that in the sense of like, maybe that's not your personality. Like I'm not necessarily the like go into a room and want to like go say hi to everybody. I might be more hanging out in the corner. But I think in your own way of like, just putting good vibes out there, right? And like just trying to help each other, like especially in security where, like we were talking today, like there's so much I point to as like the community, and there is no like, individual kind of person that's made anything happen, right? It's just a massive community of people, and I think never forgetting that, or never letting your ego get away in that, or get in the way of that, becomes important.
I think that's some fantastic advice there, and it definitely shows in your work. Like I said earlier, every time you Google Marc Maiffret over the years, you see him with various different hairstyles, but always smiling, always beaming about something, or being passionate about something. So that really reflects in yourself as well as the advice you're giving out there. So we're drawing to the end of our time here today. It's been absolutely fantastic, but there's just a couple of questions we like to ask our guests on the show. So one of them is, what could you tell us that we couldn't find out just by Googling you?
Oh, so much. What do I want to share that you that you can't Google? That's the question.
We can extend the podcast if you need some time to spill out into a full confessional.
No. Oh,
yeah. What did the FBI not find out?
Well, now you can find out about me.
You can start with allegedly if it helps your legal position.
Allegedly. I don't know if it's out there of like how I knew how the FBI was coming, but I also don't know that I'm going to share that right now.
Oh, that's a
Leave you on that
little mystery. Yeah,
I
love
that. Did you do the full Kevin Mitnick and leave them donuts though?
No, but they did show up. I think I actually put it because I didn't want it to come off like a donut joke or whatever. So I think on my like Twitter or something else, I mentioned that the FBI showed up with I think I said pastries or whatever because I didn't want to make the donut joke, but it was literally donuts. So sorry for the lie on my Twitter profile. It wasn't pastries; it was actual donuts. And my here's a fun one. I don't know if I've ever mentioned, but my mom was like a very like fierce defender of her kids, right? And so when I was raided, we were in the living room, and essentially the FBI folks were asking a bunch of questions, this that, and my mom was just kind of going off on them, right? To the point that there was a lead FBI agent and lead investigator from the DoD, and I forget which, but one of them was holding the box of donuts that they had brought with them that morning for us as like a donut peace offering or something like that. And my mom was just like being crazy Italian lady, like yelling at him and stuff, to the point the guy, like his hand started like shaking and the box of donuts was like shaking in his hand. And I'm like, I've probably maybe mentioned that at some point, but still good, interesting memory. So I remember they joked with me later. They were like, oh, wow, you've been through some stuff as a kid, huh, dude? Because they got to see some of it up front. So.
Oh, well, that's a lovely story. And thanks for sharing some of that too. Second to last question, penultimate question. If you were in our shoes, James, myself, what do you wish we asked you today?
Oof. These are you guys are throwing out the stumpers at the end. I don't know that there was anything missed. I mean, I think that's kind of to my thing. It's like I hope you guys asked everything that you were like curious to ask. You know what I mean? Like I would just say, like in that vein of like, stay curious. I don't know that I could tell you, what the thing you guys should have been curious about. I just hope that you guys, asked whatever you were curious about, and if not, we'll do a part 2 at some point.
Amazing. And then the very last, we will hold you to that. The very last question is something that's been left from our pool of other guests that we have coming on to these podcasts. So you don't know what this is.
Oh, geez.
If you were to be a Windows operating system version, which version would you be and why? And also, why is it not Millennium Edition?
I don't know if anybody needs to answer why it wouldn't be Millennium Edition. So, okay. So if I was a Windows operating system edition, which one and why? I don't know if this is a valid answer, but I think it is. But I'd be OS2 Warp. I'll leave it as close to that. Even though I think that was not quite its own thing, but it was the weird love child or whatever of IBM and Microsoft back in the day. And I think one of my I don't know why I had such a draw to that as like one of my first, like, wow, this is something interesting, different operating systems. Otherwise, I'll take the one that's fully patched, and hopefully still supported.
I love it. And yeah, Millennium Edition, I think it goes without saying, we're all on the same boat for that one.
Yeah, that one just hurts to even think about.
Oh, it was a thing. Well, no, I just want to say, really appreciate the transparency, the honesty, and the fun we've had today. Been fantastic working with you. Like, love this. Been a great interview, and just thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. It was awesome.
Absolutely, same from me. And I think we'll definitely be holding you to a part 2 at some point. So keep a gap in your calendar for us.
I would love that, guys.